Welcome to the Library of Ideas, produced by the Academy and Institute for Scientific and Educational Thought. In this fourth episode, we enter the 13th century, an age when faith and reason tried to speak the same language, and the market began to test the conscience of Christendom. The 13th century marked a profound shift in the moral geography of Europe. As trade revived and cities expanded, money, once peripheral to the moral imagination, began to reshape daily life. The church could no longer ignore the merchant, the banker, or the craftsman whose livelihoods depended on exchange. What had once belonged to the periphery of ethics now demanded theological interpretation. The question confronting medieval thinkers was unprecedented. How could one pursue material gain without endangering the soul? Drawing from Aristotle's ethics and Rome's legal rationality, scholastic thinkers such as Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas sought to domesticate the restless energy of the market within the boundaries of Christian morality. Profit, they argued, was not inherently evil, but its justification required moral clarity. The new world of trade had to be reconciled with the old world of virtue. Commerce was acceptable only if it served necessity, fairness, and the common good. This moralization of exchange became a defining feature of scholastic thought. Every act of buying and selling was a miniature test of conscience. The market was not an autonomous sphere governed by impersonal forces, but a social space answerable to divine law. To cheat, exploit, or deceive was not merely unlawful, it was sinful. In this way, the Church transformed economics into a branch of moral theology. The central question, how to trade without sin, signaled a civilization attempting to reconcile the pursuit of wealth with the preservation of the soul, the world of contracts with the order of salvation. Sometimes thought needs silence to unfold. If these ideas find a place in you, perhaps stay a little longer. Subscribe and walk with the Library of Ideas. There's much more waiting beyond this page. Let's turn it together. In a moment. Thomas Aquinas stood at the crossroads of faith, philosophy, and the emerging world of commerce. Living in an age when merchants and moneylenders began to rival knights and priests in influence, he sought to impose moral geometry upon the growing complexity of economic life. His central distinction between iustum pretium, the just price, and valor mercantilis, the market price, became the cornerstone of medieval economic ethics. The market, Aquinas conceded, had its own mechanisms. Prices rose and fell with need, scarcity, and effort. Yet moral value was not to be confused with market outcome. Justice, not profit, defined legitimacy. For Aquinas, an exchange was just only if it preserved equality between parties in both intention and effect. To sell at an unfairly high price or to buy at an unfairly low one was a form of moral fraud, an injury to the natural order created by God in measure, number, and weight. Economic behavior thus mirrored the harmony of creation itself. Imbalance was not merely social injustice, but metaphysical disorder. This vision required that traders act not only as calculators, but as moral agents. The buyer and the seller were bound by conscience, not just by contract. The just price was therefore never a fixed figure, but a spiritual equilibrium between need and fairness, labor and compassion. In elevating everyday trade to a question of salvation, Aquinas transformed the marketplace into a moral theater, a place where the arithmetic of exchange met the ethics of the soul. In the scholastic imagination, the marketplace was not merely a site of exchange, but a testing ground for the soul itself. Every act of buying and selling carried moral consequence, because each contained the potential for injustice, for taking more than one gave, for disturbing the divine balance that underpinned creation. The merchant's ledger, in this view, was not just an instrument of accounting, but a moral diary, a silent record of virtue and vice. Every profit entered without fairness marked a spiritual debt. Every act of restraint, a quiet victory over temptation. Profit, to the scholastics, was not condemned in itself. What mattered was the cause from which it arose and the intention that guided it. Gain was legitimate if earned through labor, transport, or risk, forms of service that added value to the community. But to exploit ignorance, fear, or scarcity was to corrupt the moral order. This transformed commerce into a spiritual discipline. The merchant's calling was not measured by wealth, but by the purity of purpose that directed it. A fair exchange was not a neutral event. It was an imitation of divine justice, an earthly reflection of cosmic symmetry. To deceive in trade was to wound the harmony of creation itself. Even a small overcharge carried moral gravity, for it revealed the sin of greed, avaritia, the disordering of love that placed self above community. Greed, to the scholastic mind, was not simply an appetite for more, but a blindness to proportion, the refusal to see the world as already sufficient. Thus, the Church treated the marketplace as a continuation of its moral architecture. Confession shaped the soul in private, commerce tested it in public. The buyer and the seller stood not merely as economic agents, but as moral actors bound by conscience. To cheat a neighbor was to offend God, for every act of deception disturbed the sacred arithmetic of justice. The measure of a good trader was not cunning, but equilibrium, the ability to balance profit with compassion, opportunity with honesty. In the end, the scholastics turned trade into theology. The market became a theater of salvation where the arithmetic of exchange met the ethics of grace. It was there, in the quiet negotiations of daily life, that the struggle between self-interest and virtue revealed the true currency of the human soul. Among all economic questions debated by medieval theologians, none cut deeper than the issue of usury, the charging of interest on a loan. To the scholastic mind, this was not merely an unfair practice, but a violation of cosmic law, an assault on the order of creation itself. Time, they believed, belonged to God alone, and to sell time was to presume ownership of what was sacred. Money, in this framework, was a lifeless instrument, a symbol of exchange, not a source of fertility. It could measure value, but never generate it. The very idea that wealth could reproduce itself without labor or risk appeared blasphemous, a challenge to the Creator's prerogative to bring forth something from nothing. Lending, therefore, was meant to be an act of charity, not enterprise. To lend to the poor was to participate in divine mercy. To profit from their need was to exploit the image of God in man. The usurer was condemned in sermons, paintings, and mystery plays alike, often portrayed as a wretched soul weighed down by his own coins in the fires of judgment. His sin was not greed alone, but metaphysical arrogance, the attempt to manipulate time, the most divine of measures. The prohibition of interest shaped Europe for centuries. It slowed the growth of finance, yet it preserved the moral conviction that gain must correspond to effort and service. Even as banking later emerged in Italy, it did so under layers of theological caution. Interest was redefined as lucrum cessans, compensation for loss, or masked as societas, a partnership in risk. Behind every transaction hid a whispered prayer that commerce would not trespass upon eternity. The moral scar of usury remained, a reminder that in the medieval world, even profit was answerable to heaven. To turn time into a commodity was to forget that every hour already belonged to God. Maybe that was the truest fear of all, that in seeking to master time, humanity would lose its soul to it. The scholastic worldview placed firm limits on economic ambition, yet those very boundaries became the soil from which modern commercial ethics would later grow. By forbidding usury, speculation, and excessive profit, the Church slowed the material dynamism that would define capitalism. But paradoxically, those same restrictions civilized the pursuit of gain. They taught Europe that wealth, if not tempered by conscience, corrodes both the soul and society. Economic order in this moral framework was measured not by productivity, but by justice, by the degree to which exchange preserved the dignity of every participant. The discipline of restraint had curious consequences. It restricted innovation in finance, but encouraged innovation in moral reasoning. The merchant, forced to justify his profits, became the first professional to think ethically about his work. Honest trade was elevated to a virtue. trust became a form of capital. The moral weight, once carried by confession, began to shift toward the ledger. Every coin earned had to answer not only to the market, but to heaven. This moralization of commerce shaped Europe's economic conscience. It produced a new kind of trader, self-disciplined, deliberate, introspective, who viewed business as an extension of virtue. Well, out of this moral world would later emerge the Protestant work ethic described by Max Weber, the idea that labor, diligence, and responsibility were not merely profitable but sanctified. The scholastic refusal to let money dominate the conscience gave Western civilization its most enduring insight. Prosperity without ethics leads inevitably to ruin. Modern corporations still echo this inheritance whenever they speak of integrity, social responsibility, or sustainable growth. Beneath the corporate vocabulary lies a medieval conviction that money must serve humanity, never the other way around. What the scholastics restrained materially, they liberated morally, ensuring that economic life could evolve without losing its soul. Their paradox was not failure, but foresight, the realization that to endure, wealth must remain tethered to virtue. The doctrine of the just price stands as one of the most elegant moral syntheses in Western thought, a bridge between the ancient, the legal, and the theological. From Greece, it inherited the ideal of moderation, from Rome, the precision of law, and from Christianity, the compassion of love. Together, these strands formed a vision of economic life rooted not in competition, but in proportion. The just price was never a fixed figure, but a moral relationship, a living equilibrium between human need, labor, and honesty. It was designed not to maximize wealth, but to preserve harmony, to ensure that the flow of goods did not erode the balance of souls. Its aim was justice, not efficiency. A loaf of bread, a yard of cloth, a day of labor, all were valued not by demand or scarcity, but by the fairness of exchange, by the dignity of those involved. In this moral calculus, value was measured by right intention rather than market outcome. Over time, however, this ethical architecture began to erode. The rise of cities, the growth of banking, and the spread of trade introduced new rhythms of calculation. Merchants learned to think in ledgers instead of sermons. Accounting replaced confession, and the balance sheet quietly usurped the balance of conscience. Yet the shadow of Aquinas never disappeared. The intuition that wealth without fairness is corrupting, that value detached from virtue becomes dangerous, remained deeply rooted in European thought. Even when markets claimed autonomy from theology, their moral residue lingered, like incense after a mass. We can still hear its echo today, in debates over living wages, fair trade, or corporate responsibility. Every time we speak of ethical investment or sustainable growth, we are invoking, however unconsciously, the scholastic spirit that demanded morality within exchange. The scholastics did not invent capitalism, but they gave it a conscience. They reminded later generations that economic systems are not self-justifying, that numbers cannot absolve injustice, and that prosperity must always answer to morality. The just price, long after vanishing from legal codes, survives as an ethical compass, the quiet reminder that not everything that pays is right. Thank you for listening to the Library of Ideas, a project of the Academy and Institute for Scientific and Educational Thought. Episodes of the History of Economics in 25 scenes appear every Wednesday and Saturday, a rhythm of thought for those who still believe ideas matter. Join us next time for Episode 5, The School of Salamanca from the 16th Century and the Birth of Ethical Capitalism. We'll watch how theologians became the first economists, how faith confronted finance, and how the moral logic of the church helped to invent the modern market. Until then, keep thinking, keep questioning. And remember, even virtue, like capital, needs reinvestment.